She walked into Iron Ridge Veterans Medical Center at 5:41 in the morning, carrying a duffel bag held together by a broken zipper, and her own indifference to what anyone thought of her. No rank on her chest, no committee waiting, no applause. Within 4 hours, the chief surgeon would have her reassigned to fetching coffee. Within 8, he would watch her save a man's life in front of everyone who had ever laughed at her name. Within 12, military command would walk through those doors, and Malcolm Reeves' entire career would begin to collapse. This is the story of Nurse Sara Voss, and what happened the day a veterans hospital made the worst mistake of its life. Follow this channel so you don't miss what happens next. If this story hits you, drop a like, and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The automatic doors at Iron Ridge Veterans Medical Center opened with a hiss that sounded like something exhaling after holding its breath too long. Sara Voss stepped through without pausing, the way people move through spaces they expect nothing good from. She was 32 years old, 5'6", with the kind of stillness that unsettled people who mistook it for vacancy. Her scrubs were clean but clearly worn, navy, faded at the knees. Her dark hair was pulled back without ceremony. She carried a military duffel over one shoulder, the busted zipper closed with a carabiner clip, and a laminated badge she hadn't bothered to put on yet. Creighton Falls, Montana. In late October smelled like pine and cold metal, even indoors. The hospital sat at the edge of the town limits, a 2-story federal facility surrounded by mountains that looked beautiful until the first serious winter hit, and then they looked like walls. Iro Ridge served active duty personnel from the National Guard installation nearby, veterans from 3 surrounding counties, and whatever walk-in trauma the roads brought when drivers forgot how ice worked. Sara had requested this assignment herself. That detail would matter later. At the front desk, a man in his 50s with reading glasses perched low on his nose squinted at her badge request form without looking up. Name: Sara Voss, contract nursing. I submitted paperwork Thursday. He typed something, frowned at the screen, typed again. Says here you're trauma certified, 13 years experience. That's right. He finally looked at her. His expression didn't change, which meant it had already decided something. We've got you in General Ward B for orientation. Dr. Hargrove will get you sorted. I was told trauma rotation. Dr. Hargrove, he repeated, and went back to his screen. Sara took her badge, clipped it to her collar, and walked toward the elevator. She already knew what General Ward B meant. It meant someone at the administrative level had looked at her resume, seen contract, seen temporary placement, and routed her accordingly. It happened everywhere. It had happened 3 times in the last 2 years. She had stopped being surprised by it, which wasn't the same thing as being okay with it, but it got her through doors. The elevator opened on the 2nd floor to the sound of an argument already in progress. Told radiology 8 o'clock, not 7:30, and if someone can't read a schedule, we've got a much bigger problem than... The voice belonged to a man in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, moving through the corridor like the hallway existed specifically to accommodate his stride. His white coat was pressed to an almost aggressive degree. His name badge said Dr. Garrett Lyle, Chief of Surgery, and he wore it the way some men wore watches, as evidence. He stopped when he noticed Sara standing near the elevator. Not stopped, exactly. More like his stride recalibrated, the way someone's does when an object appears in their path that they weren't expecting and aren't sure deserves a complete halt. Who are you? Sara Voss, contract trauma nurse. Starting today. Lyle looked at her badge, looked at her duffel, looked at her face. The full assessment took approximately 3 seconds. Hargrove's got you? General Ward B, apparently. I was told trauma rotation in my placement paperwork. General Ward B is where we put contract staff while they get oriented. He said it like he was explaining something to someone who'd asked why the sky was blue. Trauma rotation requires observation hours, standard protocol. I've done trauma rotations in 3 different facilities in the last... Standard protocol, he said again, and walked past her. Sara stood in the corridor for a moment. Around her, nurses moved with the careful efficiency of people who knew exactly how much they could and couldn't say in front of a chief surgeon. A younger nurse, maybe 26, with a ponytail and the expression of someone perpetually bracing for impact, gave Sara a look that managed to be sympathetic and warning at the same time before disappearing around a corner. This was fine. She had walked into worse. She found General Ward B, found Dr. Hargrove, a tired-looking woman in her 40s who seemed genuinely embarrassed by the assignment, and got to work. General Ward B at Iron Ridge was post-op recovery mostly. Veterans who'd come through surgery and needed monitoring before discharge. Medication management, vitals, documentation. It was important work. It was also roughly 1/4 of what Sara was trained to do, and she was aware of that every hour of the first 4, the way you're aware of wearing shoes 2 sizes too small. She didn't complain. She checked her patients. She documented with the kind of precision that came from years of charting in conditions where a wrong notation could mean a very different kind of catastrophe than paperwork trouble. She introduced herself to the other nurses on the ward, who were polite in the way people are polite to someone they expect to be gone in 2 weeks. At 9:15, she was in the medication room when she overheard the conversation that would change the next 12 hours of her life. 2 nurses in the corridor speaking at the volume people use when they think walls are thicker than they are. Holt scheduled for 11, routine hernia repair. He came in Monday, right? The kid from Fort Parrish? 24 years old, fit as anyone. Lyle says it's textbook. They always say textbook. Sara set down the medication tray she was preparing and stood completely still for a moment. Holt. Hernia repair. 11 o'clock. It wasn't her patient. It wasn't her ward. She had been explicitly told where her lane was and how to stay in it. She went back to her documentation, stayed there for 4 minutes. Then she walked to the pre-op wing. She told herself she was going to look at the chart. Just look. That was all. Pre-op at Iron Ridge was quieter than she expected for mid-morning. 2 patients in the bay, curtains half drawn, a respiratory tech checking equipment on the far side. The nurse assigned to prep, a heavy-set man named Davies, who Sara had been briefly introduced to during the morning handoff, was on the phone near the window, reading something from a clipboard and sounding increasingly frustrated with whoever was on the other end. Sara found Corporal Jamie Holt's chart on the rolling station outside Bay 2. He was 24, as advertised. Training injury, abdominal wall compromise, cleared for repair 3 days ago. His intake labs were clean. Blood pressure logged as normal on Monday admission. She flipped to the morning vitals. Blood pressure still clean. Oxygen sat fine. Heart rate logged at 68. She looked at the number again. 68 wasn't alarming. It wasn't even particularly notable. But something in the notation itself, the timestamp, the way the rhythm descriptor had been filled in as regular in a checkbox that looked like it had been checked without a second glance, made her pull the curtain aside. Jamie Holt was lying on the gurney looking at the ceiling with the particular expression of someone trying to convince themselves they weren't nervous. He was lean, broad-shouldered, with a fading bruise along his left jaw and the hands of someone who worked outdoors. He glanced at Sara when she came in. "Another one?" he said, not unkindly. "Another what?" "Nurse. 4th one this morning." He shrugged, or tried to. The position limited it. "Not complaining, just counting." "I'm not officially your nurse," Sara said. "I'm in the other ward. I just want to check something, if that's okay with you." "Knock yourself out." She pulled out her stethoscope. She carried it herself, hadn't trusted a supply room one in 2 years. And listened. She listened for a long time. Long enough that Holt noticed. "Something wrong?" "Probably nothing," she said, which was not a lie, technically, because she wasn't certain yet. "Does your heart ever race, or feel like it's skipping? Not from exertion, just randomly." He thought about it. "Sometimes. When I wake up, I figured it was stress." "How long has that been happening?" "Couple months, maybe." He looked at her more carefully now. "Is that something I should have told someone?" Sara straightened. "I'll be right back." She found Davies still on the phone, now looking actively aggravated. She waited 30 seconds, decided she couldn't afford 30 more, and touched his arm. He held up a finger without looking at her. She waited. He finally hung up. "Help you?" "Holton Bay 2. I think there's an irregular rhythm. I'd recommend an EKG before he goes under." Davies looked at her badge. "You're from General Ward B." "That's right." "Holt's not your patient." "I know that. I'm telling you what I heard." Davies looked at her with the expression of a man who had been managing pre-op for 11 years and did not especially want to have this conversation. "His chart's clean, vitals are normal. His resting rate looks fine, but I heard something on auscultation. It was brief and I might be wrong, but given that he's going under general anesthesia in..." She checked the clock on the wall. 80 minutes. I think it's worth 60 seconds and an EKG lead. Davies said nothing. I'll document that I raised it, Sara said. That's not a threat. It's just, I'll document it. Something shifted in Davies' expression. Not agreement exactly, more like calculation. He picked up the internal phone. Oh, Dr. Garrett Lyle arrived in pre-op 9 minutes later, and he arrived the way he did most things, which was at a pace and volume that suggested all other activity in the room should probably pause and take note. Sara was standing near the nursing station when he came through the door. Davies had briefed him in approximately 45 seconds on the phone. She could tell by the way Lyle looked at her exactly what had been said, and exactly what he thought of it. Where's the concern? He asked Davies, ignoring Sara entirely. Davies pointed at Bay 2. Lyle went in, spent approximately 4 minutes with the chart and the patient, and came back out. He looked at Sara then. You're the contract nurse from Ward B. Yes. Who asked you to evaluate my pre-op patient? Nobody asked me. I heard the case mentioned and I... You heard a case mentioned, Lyle repeated. He said it slowly, the way someone reads a sentence back that doesn't make grammatical sense. And you walked into my pre-op wing and performed an assessment on a patient that wasn't yours. I listened to his heart with a stethoscope. I didn't perform surgery. Don't be smart with me. His voice hadn't risen. That was actually the more troubling version. His chart is clean. His vitals are clean. He has been cleared by this department for a procedure that this hospital performs successfully dozens of times a year. And you... He paused. What's your name? Voss. Sara Voss. Voss. He looked at her badge as though confirming the name matched something he'd already dismissed. You've been on this floor for how many hours? 4. 4 hours. Contract placement. General Ward B. He said each phrase like a point in an argument he was winning. And in those 4 hours you've decided you know more about my patient than my pre-op team. I didn't say that. I said I heard something irregular on auscultation and I thought it warranted... It doesn't warrant anything. My team evaluated him. His chart is clean. He turned to Davies. Get her off this floor. Davies looked like he wanted to be elsewhere. Run the EKG first, Sara said. Lyle turned back to her with the expression of a man who had not expected to need to repeat himself. I'm sorry? Run the EKG. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, and I'll go back to Ward B and I won't come near your pre-op floor again. I'm asking for one test that takes 8 minutes. You're not asking, Lyle said. You're issuing directives to a department you don't work in about a patient you have no authority over, and you are wasting time that my staff does not have. He looked at Davies again. Get her out of here. And note in the log that a contract nurse from General Ward attempted unauthorized patient evaluation in pre-op. I want it documented. Sara didn't move immediately. This was the moment, and she knew it. She had been in rooms like this before. Not identical rooms, but the same architecture of power and dismissal. The same geometry of someone with authority deciding that the fastest way to resolve a problem was to remove the person raising it. She knew how to read the moment. She knew how to calculate what pushing further would cost versus what silence would cost. She thought about Jamie Holt lying in Bay 2 telling her about his heart skipping when he woke up. Couple months, maybe. She thought about general anesthesia and what it did to an already compromised cardiac rhythm. She looked at Lyle. Whatever happens in that OR this morning is going to be documented by everyone who was in this room. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered as evenly as she could manage. Lyle's expression didn't change. Davies. Sara left pre-op. She went back to General Ward B. She sat at the nursing station, pulled up her documentation interface, and wrote out everything. Time of auscultation, what she'd heard, what she'd said to Davies, what she'd said to Lyle, Lyle's response, the time she'd been removed from the floor. She wrote it in the neutral, precise language she'd spent years learning to use. Not accusatory, not emotional, just a clear record of events and clinical observations. Then she went back to her patients, and she did her job. She checked Mr. Adler in bed 3, who had hip replacement hardware causing him grief, and who liked to talk about his granddaughter's soccer games. She checked Mrs. Trout in bed 7, whose surgical drain was showing output she wanted to keep an eye on. She updated medication logs, reviewed afternoon discharge paperwork, helped a confused post-op patient remember where he was and why. At 10:51, 19 minutes before Jamie Holt was scheduled for incision, Davies appeared in the doorway of General Ward B. Sara looked up from her documentation. Davies was not a man with a particularly mobile face, but something was moving across it now that she recognized. The particular expression of someone who has just experienced a very uncomfortable vindication of someone else's position. He walked over to her station without speaking. He placed the EKG readout on the desk. Sara looked at it for 3 seconds. The rhythm strip showed exactly what she'd heard. A sustained pattern of irregular intervals. Ventricular in origin, occurring at rest. Exactly the kind of anomaly that could be missed in a quick visual chart review and catastrophically unmasked by general anesthesia. Lyle ordered it? She asked. After the second vitals check showed some variance. Davies paused. Cardiology's been paged. Holt's surgery is postponed pending cardiac workup. Sara said nothing. He's okay, Davies added, which she understood was the most important part. Caught it in time. Good. Davies picked the EKG strip back up. He stood there another moment, like he'd planned to say something else and was reconsidering it. Then he left. Sara went back to her documentation. She added one more line. 10:51 a.m., confirmed by pre-op team. Cardiac irregularity identified. Patient care adjusted accordingly. She saved it and closed the window. She was still sitting there, thinking about nothing in particular, when the first ambulance hit the bay doors at 11:23, and then the second one, and the third, and the radio crackle that traveled through the walls of Iron Ridge Veterans Medical Center carried 2 words that changed the frequency of everything. Mass casualty. It started with 12 soldiers from a National Guard field training exercise at Fort Parrish, 40 minutes north on Route 9. A vehicle rollover in a ravine. Blunt trauma, penetrating trauma, 1 confirmed burn casualty, at least 2 with compromised airways. 4 more inbound from a secondary incident at the same site that the radio traffic was still sorting out. Iron Ridge had an emergency department designed for regional trauma. It had good people. It was not built for 12 simultaneous critical arrivals with more incoming, and everyone in the building understood that within about 90 seconds of the first radio call. Sara heard the overhead announcement from Ward B and was moving before it finished. She wasn't called. Nobody had paged General Ward B. She had been specifically told, in very clear terms, where her lane was. She went to the ED anyway. The emergency department at Iron Ridge was the size of a large school gymnasium, subdivided by curtain tracks and equipment bays, and it was already approaching a level of organized chaos that was only going to get less organized. The charge nurse, a woman in her 50s named Hatch, with close-cropped gray hair and the expression of someone who'd handled bad days before and found them manageable, was running the room with a radio in one hand and a dry erase marker in the other, updating the whiteboard with incoming triage numbers. Sara appeared at her elbow. Hatch glanced at her badge. Ward B. I have trauma certification and field experience. You need hands. Hatch looked at the board, looked at the radio, looked at Sara. The look lasted about 2 seconds. Bay 7, airway compromise, blunt thoracic, go. Sara went. Bay 7 had a 20-year-old male, still in partial field gear, unconscious, with a breathing pattern that told her immediately what she was dealing with. She had seen this pattern before in places that were not hospitals and not quiet, and her hands knew what to do before she'd finished the full assessment. She called for the equipment she needed, specifically, precisely, no wasted words. And the nurse who materialized beside her, a young man named Ortega, who looked about 4 minutes from panic, responded to her tone the way people respond to voices that sound like they've done this before. Watch his chest rise on the left side, she told Ortega without looking up. Tell me if it changes. Yes, it's reduced on the left. I know. I need you to hold this position. She guided his hands. Exactly here. Don't move. Ortega held the position. Sara worked. She was 3 minutes into stabilizing the airway when she heard a voice behind her that she recognized. What is she doing in my ED? Lyle. Of course, she didn't turn around. Tension pneumothorax, right side. He needs needle decompression. She doesn't have ED authorization. Charge authorized me. She still didn't turn around. I need a 14 gauge and I need it in the next 60 seconds, and I need whoever's behind me to either help or get out of the way. There was a moment. She could feel it. The particular weight of a room waiting to see what a man like Garrett Lyle would do when the math was that stark. And then a nurse was pressing the needle into her hand, and she was moving, and the moment passed. The soldier's vitals shifted in the right direction 4 minutes later. Sara moved to the next bay. She worked through the next 2 hours the way she always worked in emergencies, which was to say, she moved fast and thought faster and spoke in the specific, clipped shorthand of someone for whom these situations were not abstract. She identified a missed splenic laceration in Bay 3 by the particular way the patient was guarding. She caught a medication dosage error in Bay 9 before it went in. She talked a terrified 22-year-old through a procedure in Bay 12 by being direct and calm and not pretending anything was fine when it wasn't. At some point during the second hour, she noticed that people had stopped questioning where she'd come from. Hatch had stopped redirecting her. Ortega had started finding her when he was unsure rather than looking for someone more senior. Even Davies, who had materialized somewhere in the first 40 minutes and was working across the room, caught her eye once and gave a brief, unambiguous nod that said more than he would have been willing to say out loud. She was between bays, reviewing a chart, when she heard someone nearby say, not to her, just into the general air, "Where did they find her?" She didn't answer. Lyle had been working in the ED too, because he was a surgeon, and that was his job, and he was whatever else he was, genuinely skilled at the mechanical part of it. But twice she'd seen him pause near a bay she'd been working in, and look at what she'd done with the particular expression of someone reassessing math they thought they'd already solved. She didn't look back at him. At 1:47 in the afternoon, between the last of the acute arrivals and the beginning of what would be a very long documentation process, Sara went to the break room, sat down at a table, and drank approximately half a cup of terrible coffee before she realized her hands were steady in a way they hadn't been in a long time. She sat with that for a moment. Outside the break room door, she could hear the department recalibrating, voices dropping from emergency register to the steadier cadence of people who'd come through something and were still standing. Hatch's voice, clear and dry, running through status updates, equipment being resupplied, a phone ringing and being answered. She was reaching for the rest of the coffee when the break room door opened. The man who came in was in his mid-50s, wearing a uniform she recognized immediately and hadn't expected to see. The insignia on his collar said Colonel. He was not wearing the uniform for effect. He was wearing it because that was what he was, and he moved through the break room with the particular economy of someone who'd learned long ago that rank didn't need announcement. He saw her. He stopped. And the expression that crossed his face in that moment was not one she could easily categorize, but it wasn't surprise. He pulled out the chair across from her, sat down, and placed a manila folder on the table between them. She looked at the folder. The header on the tab was redacted, but the file number below it, she knew that number. She'd seen it on exactly one other document in her life, and that document had been sealed. The colonel looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Sara." And the break room, which had been a neutral and impersonal space a moment ago, became something else entirely. She set her coffee down. Outside, she could hear Hatch's voice still running through the status board, the ordinary machinery of the department grinding forward. Inside the break room, something that had been sealed for a very long time was about to open. The colonel's name was Raymond Cook, and he didn't ask permission before he sat down. That alone told Sara something. Men who asked permission before sitting tended to want something from you. Men who simply sat down already had it, or believed they did. She didn't speak first. That had been a discipline she'd learned slowly and kept imperfectly, but she'd kept it. Cook looked at her across the table for a moment that stretched past comfortable into something else, the kind of silence that was doing work on both sides. Then he opened the manila folder without ceremony, turned it, and slid it across the table. She didn't look at it immediately. She looked at him. "How did you find me?" she said. "You weren't hiding." He said it without judgment. "You filed contract placement paperwork through a federal nursing registry. Your credentials are your credentials, Sara. You can't make those smaller than they are without also making yourself useless, and you're not someone who accepts useless." "That's not an answer." "It is. Just not the one you wanted." He nodded toward the folder. "Look at it." She looked at it. The document on top was a personnel flag. She'd seen the format before, knew what the red border on the edge meant. Below, it was a request form, 2 signatures she recognized and one she didn't, And below that, 3 pages she read carefully and without expression. When she finished, she closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. "I'm not going back," she said. "Nobody's asking you to go back to anything." Cook folded his hands on the table. He had a soldier's hands, wide, scarred across the knuckles of the left one, a thin white line along his right thumb that she knew from experience was a blade and not an accident. What happened today? What happened today was 12 people from a training accident needed emergency care, and a hospital was short-staffed. "What happened today?" Cook said, patient in the way of someone who has decided they will finish their sentence regardless, was that a restricted placement contract nurse from General Ward B ran trauma response at a level that triggered a federal wellness flag on this facility's staffing records. He paused. "Which is what brought me here in the first place. But I was already on my way." Sara was quiet for a moment. Outside the break room door, someone's radio crackled. Hatch giving a bed count update, her voice carrying the steady professionalism of someone who had not stopped working since 11:20. "How long?" Sara asked. "Since you signed the contract here. The placement registry runs automatic flags on certain credential profiles. Yours is distinctive. I changed my documentation. You changed your name on the contract form. Your certifications are federal records." He looked at her evenly. "You know how federal records work." She did. That was the problem with the kind of training she'd had. It left marks in systems that didn't forget. "So what do you want?" she said. Cook was quiet for a moment. Then, "I want to understand why someone with your record is filing for rural contract placements in facilities where nobody's going to look at her too closely. Because I'm good at the work and I wanted somewhere quiet." "You've been somewhere quiet for 2 years." "Then I was enjoying it." He almost smiled. "Almost." "Sara, don't. I'm not here to pull you back into anything. I mean that." He leaned back slightly. "But I need to understand what happened 14 months ago well enough to determine whether this flag needs to go into your permanent record or whether it gets resolved at the field level and we all move on." The fluorescent light above them buzzed once, steadied. Sara looked at the table. 14 months ago. She'd known this conversation would happen eventually. She had arranged her life quietly and methodically so that it would happen later rather than sooner, and she had apparently run out of later. "That conversation isn't going to happen in a break room," she said. "No," Cook agreed. "It's not." He retrieved the folder, closed it, tucked it under his arm. "There's going to be an administrative review of today's response. Standard mass casualty protocol. You'll be interviewed as part of that." "I'm contract staff?" "You were the primary responder in 3 of the 4 most critical bays during the first hour. Contract or otherwise, you're part of the review." He stood. "Get something to eat. The interview will be this evening." He left without looking back. Sara sat at the table for a while longer. She finished the coffee, which had gone completely cold. She looked at the wall, which told her nothing, which was fine. Then she went back to work, because there was still work to do and because stopping was not something she was built for. General Ward B felt smaller when she returned to it. That was the nature of the thing. You spent 2 hours operating at the outer edge of what you were capable of, and then you came back to the space someone had decided was your appropriate container, and the ceiling felt lower. She'd experienced the feeling before. It was manageable. What you did with it was the question. She checked on Mr. Adler, whose hip was causing him more grief than usual, and who had apparently told the afternoon nurse that the pain medication wasn't working, which Sara spent 10 minutes reading into and another 10 flagging for the attending physician because the pattern looked like it warranted closer attention rather than an automatic dosage bump. Mr. Adler appreciated the attention more than the solution, which she understood. She was finishing the last of her afternoon documentation when Ortega appeared at the ward entrance. I was still in his ED scrubs, which meant he hadn't gone home yet, and he was holding a cup of coffee from the machine down the hall with both hands like it was something valuable. "Hey," he said. "Hey." He stood in the doorway for a moment. Ortega was young. She'd clocked him at 24, 25, and he had the look of someone still assembling his professional confidence from parts that hadn't all arrived yet. During the emergency, he'd been scared and functional, which was the right combination and not as common as you'd hope. "I just wanted to say," he started. "You did good today," Sara said, without looking up from her documentation. "Bay 7, the airway. You held position exactly right, and you didn't freeze." Ortega seemed to recalibrate. I was going to say that to you. I've been doing it longer, accept the compliment. He was quiet for a moment. Then, how did you know it was tension pneumo that fast? I didn't even, I got there eventually, but you were already pattern recognition. She saved her documentation and looked at him. You learn the patterns, and then you stop thinking through the checklist and you start just seeing it. Takes time. You'll get there. Did you do a residency program or continuing education, she said, which was not a lie. It just omitted a significant portion of the context. Ortega nodded slowly, in the way of someone who had noticed the door closing but was politely declining to push on it. Okay. He lifted his coffee in a vague salute. Thanks, for today. Get some sleep, she said. He left. She sat for a moment in the quiet of General Ward B, listening to the monitors and the building settling into its evening rhythms. And she thought about Ortega at 24 holding a position he'd been guided into by someone he didn't know, under pressure, without freezing. There were good people in this building. She'd known that since this morning, from Hatch's controlled competence and Davy's grudging integrity, and the way even the most overwhelmed nurses had kept showing up to the next bay and the next one. The problem was not the people. The problem, in her experience, was rarely the people. It was almost always the architecture of who got to decide what the people did. The administrative review convened at 6:15 in the hospital's second-floor conference room, which had a view of the parking lot and the mountains beyond it going dark blue in the early evening. 7 people around a table. The hospital administrator, a woman named Paula Fenwick, who wore the expression of someone who'd already read the preliminary incident report and was not enjoying it. Hatch, representing ED operations, a risk management officer named Beale, 2 trauma physicians who'd been on during the emergency, Colonel Cook, who sat to one side and said nothing during the preliminary portion, and Garrett Lyle, who sat across from Sara and had the particular posture of a man who believed he was in this room to confirm conclusions that had already been reached. Sara had showered and changed into clean scrubs. She had her documentation on a tablet, every entry time stamped, every observation clinical and unambiguous. Fenwick opened the review. It was, for the first 40 minutes, a fairly standard mass casualty after-action discussion. Response times, resource allocation, patient outcomes, what had worked, and what needed improvement. Hatch spoke with authority. The trauma physicians spoke with the measured precision of people who knew their words were being recorded. Beale took notes and asked occasional clarifying questions about protocol adherence. Sara answered questions when asked and did not offer information when she wasn't. This was a skill she had developed through practice. Then Beale said, I'd like to address the pre-op incident from this morning. The temperature in the room shifted by approximately 3 degrees. Lyle sat up slightly. Fenwick looked at her notes. According to the log, Beale said, at 9:22 a.m., a contract nurse from General Ward B entered the pre-op wing and conducted an unauthorized patient assessment on a pre-surgical patient. He looked at Sara. That was you? I listened to a patient's heart with my stethoscope and reported what I heard to the assigned pre-op nurse. I then spoke to Dr. Lyle directly when the pre-op nurse relayed my concern. You entered a restricted wing without authorization. Pre-op is not a restricted wing. It has a sign that asks visitors to check in at the desk. I was not a visitor. I was a nursing staff member on duty, and there was no one at the desk when I arrived. Beale made a note. Dr. Lyle, your account? Lyle's account was delivered in the measured tones of a man who had been constructing it since approximately 10 a.m. It was thorough, and it was detailed, and it was mostly accurate in its facts while being very precise about what it emphasized and what it left out. He described the violation of chain of command. He described the disruption to pre-op routine. He described Sara as having overstepped her role significantly and in a manner that undermined departmental authority. He did not describe the EKG results, not directly. He mentioned that additional cardiac screening was ordered as part of routine pre-surgical diligence, and that the patient's surgery had been rescheduled for medical reasons, but the language was constructed to suggest that this was a naturally occurring procedural step rather than a response to anything Sara had said. Sara watched him deliver this account and said nothing. Fenwick looked at her when Lyle finished. Nurse Voss, response? The cardiac irregularity I identified on auscultation at approximately 9:15 was confirmed by EKG at 10:51. Sara kept her voice level. The irregularity in question, a sustained ventricular arrhythmia pattern, would have presented significant risk under general anesthesia. The patient's surgery was rescheduled pending cardiology workup. Corporal Holt is currently stable and will require specialist follow-up before any surgical intervention. She paused. The documentation I filed at 9:40 includes a time-stamped record of my observation, my report to Davies, my conversation with Dr. Lyle, and Dr. Lyle's response. She set the tablet on the table and slid it to Fenwick. Fenwick read it. The room was quiet for a moment that was much longer than it was. Lyle said, "The point is protocol. The outcome is that a 24-year-old soldier is alive and not in a surgical crisis," Hatch said from down the table. It was the first thing Hatch had said in 20 minutes, and the flatness of it landed in the room with a particular kind of weight. Lyle looked at her. Hatch looked back at him with the expression of someone who had been in emergency medicine for a very long time and was not afraid of eye contact. "The protocol concern is noted," Fenwick said carefully, "and will address chain of command procedure in the follow-up review." She closed the tablet and slid it back to Sara. "I also want to address the emergency response this afternoon. Nurse Voss, you responded to the mass casualty event from General Ward B without being paged. Charge authorized me when I arrived. After the fact, Hatch can speak to the circumstances." "I authorized her," Hatch said. "I had 12 incoming criticals, and I needed hands that knew what they were doing. She knew what she was doing. That's the entirety of the decision." Fenwick made a note. "The outcome in the 3 bays where Nurse Voss served as primary responder?" One of the trauma physicians, a man named Carver, who had barely spoken since the meeting started, said, "Bay 7 is a potential mortality save. The pneumothorax was correctly identified and addressed in a timeline that would have been significantly worse without early intervention." He paused. "Bay 3, the splenic flag she raised went to surgery 2 hours later, and the attending confirmed significant internal hemorrhage. That one, yes, that one mattered." Silence. Lyle was looking at the window. Fenwick said, "Colonel Cook, you've been with us through this review. Do you have anything to add?" Cook had not moved from his position since the review began. He had the quality of someone who had been in a great many rooms like this one and knew the specific value of waiting until everyone else had finished. He said, "I'd like to request 5 minutes with the full review panel after this meeting concludes." He looked at Fenwick. "There's additional context regarding Nurse Voss's credentialing history that's relevant to this discussion." Sara went very still. "Of course," Fenwick said. Lyle finally looked away from the window. He looked at Cook, then at Sara. Something moved through his expression, not quite unease, but adjacent to it. The review concluded its formal portion. People collected their materials. Sara sat and waited for whatever Cook was about to do. He had the room ask her to step outside first. That was the part that cost her something. Standing in the corridor outside the conference room while 7 people she'd spent a day working alongside learned something about her that she had spent 14 months ensuring nobody would learn. The corridor was quiet at 6:50 in the evening. One passing orderly, a distant phone. The fluorescent lights here were better than in the break room. Steadier, less of that low-level buzz that sat below conscious perception and wore on you. She stood with her back to the wall and her arms at her sides, and she breathed. She was not someone who fell apart. She had learned this about herself in conditions that were somewhat more extreme than a hospital corridor, which meant she knew it with a certainty that was almost physical. But not falling apart and not feeling anything were not the same thing, and she felt quite a lot, standing there, thinking about what Cook might be saying. The door opened after 9 minutes. Fenwick came out first. She had an expression that Sara couldn't immediately categorize. Not hostile, not sympathetic, something more complicated that suggested her assumptions had been revised in the last 9 minutes, and she was still working out how to recalibrate. "Nurse Voss." She stopped in front of Sara. "I want to apologize for the length of this process." Sara blinked. "Okay?" "Colonel Cook has provided documentation that significantly changes the context of this review." Fenwick paused. "I was not aware of the full scope of your credentials when you were placed at this facility. I don't believe anyone in administration was." "I'm aware of that." Fenwick seemed to be choosing her next words with unusual care. "The Colonel would like to speak with you privately. The panel will reconvene tomorrow morning for follow-up. In the meantime, another pause. I've spoken with Dr. Lyle about the pre-op incident and we'll be addressing that separately. Sara said, Is the protocol concern still on my record? Fenwick met her eyes. No. Sara nodded once. She went back into the conference room. The panel members had gone. Cook was standing near the window, looking at the parking lot and the darkening mountains. He turned when she came in. What did you tell them? She said. The parts that mattered. Which parts, specifically? He walked back to the table and sat down, and she sat down across from him again, and it felt like the break room except that something had shifted. Some variable in the atmosphere of the conversation that she couldn't name exactly, but could feel. Your deployment record, he said. Combat nursing credentials. Field trauma certifications. The commendations. He paused. The incident at Keller Forward Operating Base. The words landed in the room quietly and stayed there. Sara looked at the table. I told them the version that's in the record, Cook said, not the version you've been carrying. They're not the same version. No, they're not. He leaned forward slightly. The official record shows a decorated combat nurse who performed beyond distinction in a critical field emergency and was subsequently medically released with full commendations. That's what I showed them. And the other version? The other version, he said carefully, is why you're in Creighton Falls on a contract placement instead of running a trauma unit somewhere. He looked at her directly. And that's a conversation that I think you've been avoiding for 14 months, and I'm not going to make you have it tonight. Something in Sara's chest did something she didn't entirely have language for. Then why bring it up, she said. Because you need to know that I know it, and that what I showed them tonight was accurate. He paused. What happened at Keller wasn't your fault. The board's finding reflected that. The board's finding and what actually happened are, I know. His voice was quiet. I was there, Sara. The room was completely still. She hadn't known that. She'd seen his name in the report at the edges. A signature, a rank notation. But she hadn't connected it to a face, hadn't known until this moment that the colonel sitting across from her had been part of the chain that had reviewed Keller. She looked at him for a long time. You were on the review panel, she said. I was the one who pushed for the full exoneration record. There were members who wanted a different notation. He met her eyes. I know what you did that night. Not the version the report describes. The actual version. Sara breathed. Outside, the mountains were fully dark now. The parking lot lights had come on, yellow and flat against the windows. Why are you here? She said. Not the flag, not the review. Why are you actually here? Cook was quiet for a moment. Because in 14 months, you've taken 4 contract placements in facilities where nobody would recognize your name or your record. And today you walked into an emergency without hesitation, and you performed at a level that... He stopped, started again. There are people who need what you know, Sara. Not in a field necessarily, not in a way that costs you the same things again. But here, or somewhere like here, he paused. Wasting it in Ward B felt like the wrong outcome. Sara didn't answer that immediately. She thought about Ortega holding a position in Bay 7 without freezing. She thought about the soldier in Bay 3 whose splenic laceration she'd caught because she'd seen the way he was guarding and she'd known, not suspected, known, what it meant. She thought about Jamie Holt in the pre-op bay, telling her his heart skipped when he woke up sometimes. Couple months, maybe. I'm not ready to have the Keller conversation, she said. I'm not asking you to. I mean in general. With anyone. Understood. She stood up. I'm going to finish my documentation for the evening, and then I'm going to sleep, because I have been awake since 4 a.m., and I worked a mass casualty event. She picked up her tablet. If there's a formal review tomorrow, I'll be there. 7:30, Cook said. Administrator's office. She went to the door, then stopped. The patients from the training accident, she said. All of them stable? As of an hour ago, yes. She nodded. She left. The night shift at Iron Ridge was quieter than the day in the way that hospital nights always were. Not truly quiet, but a different register of sound, more spaces between things. The corridors smelled like cleaning solution, and the ventilation system had a lower hum. Nurses moved with the particular efficiency of people who'd been doing this long enough that fatigue had become a texture rather than an event. Sara was in the documentation room off Ward B, finishing her daily notes, when she heard footsteps in the corridor that she recognized by their weight and rhythm before the person appeared. Lyle. He came to the doorway of the documentation room and stopped there. He was in his coat still, which meant he'd been here all evening, which she'd expected. The mass casualty afternoon generated hours of follow-up work, and whatever else Lyle was, he didn't leave that work to other people. He looked at her. She looked at him. The thing about a man like Garrett Lyle, Sara had learned today, was that his arrogance was not entirely affectation. He was genuinely skilled. She'd watched him work during the emergency. Hands precise, decision-making fast, no wasted movement. He had earned some portion of his confidence through competence. That was the complicated part. It was always more complicated when they were good at the actual job. You filed documentation on this pre-op conversation, he said. Yes. Before the emergency. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. His jaw worked slightly. That was... He stopped. Started differently. The cardiac finding this morning was real. Yes. I don't... He stopped it again. This was clearly not a conversation he had wanted to have, and had not quite succeeded in talking himself out of. I don't typically review auscultation findings from Ward B nurses without some basis for... You didn't know me, she said. I understand that. Something in his expression shifted, not toward warmth exactly, but toward something more honest than the previous version. That's not... He exhaled through his nose. What Cook told the panel tonight about your background. What about it? Is it accurate? Yes. He looked at the door frame, then at her, then somewhere in between. You should have told someone when you arrived. I filled out a contract placement form. My credentials are listed. Not all of them, apparently. No, she said. Not all of them. Another silence. This one was different from the earlier ones between them. Less combative, more like two people standing on the same piece of ground and being uncertain what to do with that. The soldier in Bay 3, Lyle said, splenic. Carver had it in surgery by 5. I know. I was in the OR. He paused. You caught it on assessment. Yes. That would have... He stopped. Yes. He put one hand briefly on the door frame. The review tomorrow. Fenwick is... He cleared his throat. The pre-op notation. That's being handled. She looked at him directly. You're going to be asked about your conduct this morning. Not by me. By Fenwick and by Cook. His jaw tightened. I'm aware. Okay, she said. He stood there another moment. She had the sense that he wanted to say something that would function as an apology without being structured enough to be one, and that he couldn't quite get it to come out of his mouth in a form he was willing to hear himself say. She didn't push him on it. He left. Sara sat in the documentation room for a while after his footsteps faded. The night shift hummed around her. She finished her notes, reviewed tomorrow's ward assignments, and noted that someone had added a notation to her file, a temporary suspension of the pre-op protocol flag, pending tomorrow's review. She picked up her tablet and walked down the corridor toward the small nursing lounge at the end of Ward B. She was 3 feet from the lounge door when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Montana area code. She answered. Voss. Silence on the line for 2 seconds. Then a voice she hadn't heard in 14 months. Male, in its 30s, familiar in the specific way that people who've been through shared extremity are familiar, which was not the same as comfortable. Sara. The voice was flat in a way that meant something had happened. It's Marcus. Marcus Dean, field medic, 3rd deployment. She'd worked alongside him for 11 months before Keller. How did you get this number? She said. Cook gave it to me. A pause. I need to talk to you about something. When? Now would be better. She pushed open the lounge door. The room was empty. 2 chairs, a vending machine, a window showing nothing but her own reflection, and the dark outside. She sat down in the nearer chair. Talk, she said. You know Captain Rice is out of Bethesda? Marcus said. As of last week? She was quiet. Captain Aaron Rice, Forward Tactical Commander, Keller Forward Operating Base. The man whose decisions on the night of the Keller incident had, according to the official record, been reviewed and found within operational parameters, according to the official record. Sara. Marcus's voice was careful now. He's been talking. To people who are writing things down. Her stomach went cold. What kind of things? She said. His version of Keller. a pause that felt like it was carrying weight. And his version has you in a different position than the official record. She stood up from the chair without deciding to. He's claiming you made a call you weren't authorized to make, Marcus said, and that the outcome... He stopped. He's building a case, Sara. I don't know who he's building it for yet, but he's building it. Outside the lounge window, the parking lot lights burned yellow and flat. The mountains were invisible beyond them, present but not visible, which was not the same thing as gone. She thought about Cook saying, I know what you did that night, the actual version. She thought about the sealed folder and the flag, and the 14 months she'd spent arranging her life so that no one would ask the question Marcus Dean was asking right now. Send me what you have, she said. Already did. Check your email. She ended the call. She stood in the empty lounge with the vending machine humming and the window showing her her own face, and she thought about Keller. Not the report, not the official record, but the actual night, the specific sequence of decisions and their consequences, the weight of what she'd done, and whether she would do it again. She thought about what she'd told Lyle. I only cared about the patient staying alive. That was still true. It was possible it wasn't going to be enough. Her phone buzzed again. Not a call this time, the email notification, and she opened it, and she read what Marcus had sent, and when she finished reading it, she sat down very slowly in the chair and looked at the window and the reflection looking back at her. The door to the nursing lounge opened. She looked up. Colonel Cook was standing in the doorway, and he had an expression on his face that she had never seen there before. Not the controlled professionalism of the review room or the careful patience of the break room, but something sharper and more urgent, and in his hand was his own phone, screen lit. You got Dean's email, he said. Not a question. Just now. Then you know Rice has been in contact with a congressional oversight inquiry. He stepped into the room. And you know what that means? She did know. It meant the sealed version of Keller was about to become considerably less sealed. It meant 14 months of carefully arranged distance was about to compress to zero. And it meant that whatever she had been trying to protect herself from, the scrutiny, the questions, the specific weight of being looked at by people with the authority to decide what her actions meant, was no longer something she could walk away from. Cook looked at her. There's a call in 20 minutes, he said, with JAG and the oversight coordinator. I need to know if you want counsel present. Sara looked at her phone. She looked at the window. She looked at the reflection of a woman who had spent 14 months making herself smaller than she was, and she thought about all the ways that had and hadn't worked. No counsel, she said. I want to give them the actual version. Cook was quiet for a moment. That's going to complicate things, he said. It already is complicated. She stood up. It's been complicated for 14 months. Might as well start saying the true things. She walked to the door. Cook stepped aside to let her through, and just before she cleared the doorway, he said quietly, For what it's worth, I don't think you made the wrong call at Keller. Sara stopped. She stood in the doorway with the corridor's fluorescent light falling across her and the dark window of the lounge behind her. I know, she said. That's not what keeps me up. She walked out into the corridor and the door swung shut behind her, and somewhere in the building a monitor alarmed briefly and then settled back to its ordinary rhythm, and Iron Ridge Veterans Medical Center moved deeper into its night, carrying everything that was about to come undone. The call lasted 47 minutes. Sara sat in a small administrative office on the first floor that Cook had requisitioned without asking anyone, with a laptop open on the desk and the speakerphone set between them, and she talked to a JAG attorney named Whitfield and an oversight coordinator named Sato, who both had the careful voices of people paid to listen without reacting. She told them the actual version of Keller, not the constructed one, not the version that had been shaped by the people present who had reasons for it to have a particular shape. The version she carried, the specific sequence of events on a night 14 months ago at a forward operating base in a country she was no longer allowed to name in certain documents, when a commanding officer had made a call that she had believed would result in preventable deaths, and she had made a different call, and she had been right, and it had cost her anyway. She didn't editorialize. She didn't perform emotion. She described the medical situation as she had assessed it, the decision she had made, the outcome, and the sequence of events that followed. She was precise about timeline, precise about procedure, and when Whitfield asked her questions, she answered them directly, and without elaboration she hadn't already offered. When she finished, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to mean something. Sato said, "Nurse Voss, Captain Rice's account characterizes your intervention as unauthorized, and it was unauthorized," Sara said. "I know that. I made an unauthorized medical call because the authorized call was going to kill 2 people, and I had the training and the position to prevent it, and I chose to do that." She paused. "I've known for 14 months that account was in a file somewhere. I'm not surprised it's surfacing. I want the record to show that I'm not contesting the characterization of unauthorized. I'm contesting the characterization of wrong." Another silence. Cook, beside her, said nothing. His hands were flat on the desk. Whitfield said, "We're going to need formal statements, written, signed, within 72 hours. Fine. And we'll need your full deployment record unsealed for review. Fine." The call ended. Sara closed the laptop. Cook looked at her. "You knew that would open the full record?" "Yes." "Including the Rice complaint?" "Yes." She stood. "If the full record opens, then the full record opens. I'm tired of managing the size of the box I live in." He looked at her for a moment. "Okay," he said, which was all he said. She went back to Ward B. It was past 9. She was running on 4 hours of sleep from the previous night and an adrenaline debt that was starting to collect, and she had paperwork she hadn't finished and a ward to hand off to the night nursing lead. She did all of that. She did it carefully. At 10:15, she was walking toward the overnight staff quarters. Iron Ridge had a small residence wing for on-call personnel, and her contract placement included access, when the overhead intercom ran a tone that she recognized before the words. "Trauma alert. Emergency department. All available personnel." She stopped in the corridor. She had been on since 5 a.m. She had managed 2 crises, a formal review, a JAG call, and a conversation that would determine a significant portion of her future. Her body was carrying the specific weight of a day that had been too much stacked into too few hours. She turned around and went back toward the ED. The soldier's name was Sergeant Dale Pruitt, 31 years old, from the same Fort Parrish training exercise that had sent 12 casualties through the doors that morning. He had been treated and cleared in the afternoon. A moderate concussion assessment, some bruising, sent to the overnight observation ward with a standard neuro-check schedule. At 10:18, his roommate in the observation ward had noticed that Pruitt wasn't responding to his name. By the time the night nurse reached him, his blood pressure had dropped to a number that meant the afternoon assessment had missed something serious, and he was being moved to the ED on a gurney by the time Sara came through the doors. The night ED had a skeleton crew. That was the nature of it. Overnight staffing at a regional veterans facility in a town of 11,000 people was not built for back-to-back crises. The attending on duty was a physician named Ellsworth, early 50s, competent in the steady way of someone who managed what typically came through overnight and was now calculating whether what was in front of him exceeded that. His calculation was visible in his face when Sara arrived. "What do we have?" she said to the nearest nurse, a woman named Torres, who had been in the afternoon response and clearly hadn't gone home. "Hypotensive, GCS dropping. He was cleared this afternoon for concussion." Torres lowered her voice. "His afternoon CT was read as negative." Sara looked at Pruitt on the gurney. He was the kind of pale that was a specific color rather than a degree, grayish, underlaid with something that told her before anything else did what the problem was likely to be. "Delayed bleed," she said. Torres looked at her. "Afternoon CT. Epidural hematomas can be lucid interval presentations. He may have been genuinely fine at 4 o'clock. She was already at the gurney. "Who's the radiologist on overnight?" "Marsh, but he's not." "Paige Marsh, get me another CT, head and cervical, right now, and I need a line in and fluids running." She looked at Ellsworth, who had come to the other side of the gurney. "BP?" 84/50 and falling. "He needs neurosurgery." She said it straight, no softening. "Not tomorrow. Not after we see what happens. Now." Ellsworth looked at her. He was a man who did not know her, who had come on shift after the day's events, and had not been in the afternoon review. He saw a nurse in scrubs with Ward B credentials and a level of authority in her voice that did not match those credentials on paper. She watched him calculate this. "Who are you?" he said. "Contract nurse. I was primary responder in 3 critical bays this afternoon, and I need you to make a decision in the next 30 seconds. She kept her voice even, not aggressive, flat, Certain. Page neurosurgery and get this man to CT, or we're going to lose him on a diagnosis that someone already missed once today. Ellsworth looked at Pruitt, at the monitor, at Sara. Page neurosurgery, he said to Torres. Sara was already moving. The next 22 minutes were the kind that compressed time into a different unit than minutes. CT confirmed it. A growing epidural hematoma, right temporal, the slow bleed that had built while Pruitt walked the afternoon halls, apparently fine, and then had crossed a threshold somewhere around 10 p.m. Neurosurgery came in the form of a surgeon named Baird, who'd been called from home, half awake, and then very awake when he saw the scan, and who looked at Sara once across the imaging suite with an expression that was purely clinical and said, "He needs the OR now." "Yes," she said. They moved. Sara did not go to the OR. She was not a surgeon, and there was no role for her in the room where Pruitt's outcome would actually be determined. What she had done was get him there, and that was the boundary of it, and she stood in the corridor outside the imaging suite and felt the particular hollow that came after emergency. The drop from functional intensity to a stillness that had nowhere obvious to go. Torres appeared beside her. "Good catch," she said quietly. "Afternoon CT wasn't wrong when it was read," Sara said. "This stuff evolves. That's the thing people forget. It's not that the first assessment was bad. It's that the pathology changes." Torres was quiet for a moment. "You've seen it before." "Too many times." They stood there briefly in the corridor, the way people stood after something had almost gone very wrong, and hadn't. Then Torres said, "Lyle's in the building." Sara looked at her. "Came in when the alert went out. He's—" Torres paused. "He's in the consultation room with Administrator Fenwick and Colonel Cook. At 10:30 at night. Apparently there's been a communication, something from the oversight inquiry." Torres hesitated. "I don't know the details. I just know they've been in there for 20 minutes and the door's closed." Sara processed this. The oversight inquiry that she'd spoken to 3 hours ago on a JAG call was the kind of machinery that, once moving, did not wait for convenient hours. She had known that when she'd agreed to give them the actual version of Keller, she had understood what she was starting. She just hadn't expected it to reach the consultation room at Iron Ridge before she'd slept. "Thanks," she said to Torres. She walked down the corridor. She could see the consultation room from 30 feet away. The closed door, the light visible at the gap underneath it. She stopped in the corridor and thought about what was behind that door and what it meant that those three people were in a room together at this hour. Cook and Fenwick she could construct. The inquiry had moved fast, contacted the facility, and Cook was managing the institutional side of what she'd put in motion. Lyle in that room at this hour, with an overnight crisis just concluded and an oversight inquiry running. That was a combination of pressures she hadn't quite arranged in her mind yet, and she stood in the corridor working it out. She didn't have to work it long. The consultation room door opened. Lyle came out first. He walked with his eyes down, coat on, moving like a man who was going somewhere and had not decided yet where that was. He passed within 10 feet of Sara in the corridor, and he saw her. She knew he saw her because his stride altered, a fractional adjustment, the kind you make when you notice something and are deciding how to respond to it. He didn't stop. He went toward the exit doors. Fenwick came out next, saw Sara, and walked toward her with the expression she'd had outside the conference room. Revised assumptions, recalibrating. "Nurse Voss, we've been looking for you. I was in the ED. We heard. Torres updated us." Fenwick stopped in front of her. "Pruitt is in surgery." "Yes." "That's the second time today that a patient outcome depended significantly on your intervention." Fenwick said it carefully, not as a compliment exactly, more as a statement of record being established. "I want you to know that we're documenting tonight's response as well." "Okay." "Colonel Cook is going to speak with you now. If that's—" Fenwick paused. "There are some developments from the oversight inquiry that he needs to brief you on. Tonight." Sara looked at the closed consultation room door. "Is it the Rice account?" she said. Fenwick's expression confirmed it without her saying yes. Sara went to the door. She pushed it open. Cook was standing on the far side of the table, and he had the look of a man who had just gotten off a call that had rearranged several things he thought he'd understood. On the table in front of him was a printed document, several pages, paper-clipped, and even from the doorway she could see the header. Official Inquiry, Keller Incident Reassessment. She walked in. She closed the door. "Talk," she said. Rice gave a formal statement to the inquiry this afternoon, Cook said, 3 hours after we called in your account. He named you as the primary responsible party for a patient death at Keller. The room was very quiet. Sara stood with her hands at her sides. There was no patient death at Keller that I was responsible for. I know that. Cook looked at her steadily. But he's claiming there was a secondary casualty in the field following your intervention. He's claiming your unauthorized call caused a chain of events that he stopped. It's constructed. I can see how it's constructed, but it's in a formal statement, and the inquiry coordinator is going to want a response. Then I'll give them a response. There's more. He picked up the document, held it. 2 of the personnel present at Keller have already been contacted by Rice's legal representative. One of them has agreed to support his account. Sara looked at him. Who? She said. Cook set the document on the table and slid it toward her. She looked at the name printed in the witness section. Her stomach did something she didn't have language for. The name was Marcus Dean, the same Marcus Dean who had called her 2 hours ago to warn her. The same voice, flat with urgency, telling her Rice was building a case. She looked at the date on Dean's statement. It was dated 4 days ago, 4 days before he'd called her, 4 days before the warning that had felt like loyalty. She looked at Cook. He already signed it. Yes. And then he called me. Yes. She stood with the document in her hands, and the specific weight of that settled through her, not just betrayal, which was its own thing and familiar enough in her life, but the more complicated understanding that people did contradictory things for reasons that made sense to them internally, and Marcus Dean had signed a statement he was willing to sign and then called her anyway, and she didn't know yet what that meant. Why would he call me if he'd already... She started. I don't know. Cook said it plainly. But I need you to understand what this means for the inquiry. With Rice's statement and Dean's corroboration, the overnight JAG coordinator has moved this from a standard review to a formal board process. Sara set the document down. When? She said. 72 hours. Cook met her eyes. There's going to be a formal board of review, Sara. Your full record unsealed, your statement against Rice's account, Dean's testimony, everything from Keller on the table. And the board has the authority to determine whether your nursing license is... I know what the board has authority to do, she said. The room held the silence. She thought about a man she'd trusted for 11 months. She thought about a phone call that had felt like warning and was apparently something else, something more complicated and less clean than warning. She thought about her license, the thing she'd built everything on, the thing she'd carried through 14 months of contract placements in places where nobody would look too hard, the thing that let her walk into an emergency department and be useful. She thought about Sergeant Pruitt, upstairs right now in an OR, alive because she'd caught something that had almost been missed twice. She thought about what she'd said to Cook in the nursing lounge. Might as well start saying the true things. Get me a pen, she said. Cook reached into his jacket and produced one. She picked up the document and flipped to the response section, and she started writing, in her clean clinical hand, the actual version of the night at Keller Forward Operating Base. The sequence of decisions, the medical reality, the outcome, the specific and unambiguous truth that she had not let herself say at full volume in 14 months. She wrote for 11 minutes without stopping. When she finished, she set the pen down, looked at what she'd written, and signed her name at the bottom. She slid it across to Cook. He read it. When he looked up, something in his face was different than it had been all day. Not softer exactly, but more settled. This is going to the board, he said. Good. Rice is going to challenge every line of it. I know. And Dean's testimony, Marcus was there, she said. He knows what actually happened. Whatever he signed, he knows. She picked up the pen and set it back on the table. People sometimes sign things that aren't entirely true and then call someone to warn them. It means he's not entirely comfortable with what he signed. That's optimistic. It's realistic, she said. He called me. That means something, even if I don't know yet what. Cook folded the document carefully. The board convenes in 72 hours. You'll need to be available. I'll be here. She picked up her tablet from the table and walked to the door. She was tired in a way that had moved past the ordinary register of tired into something that was going to require more than sleep to address. But sleep was the next available step, and she was going to take it. She opened the door. In the corridor outside, standing with his back to the wall and his arms crossed and the expression of a man who had been waiting for a period of time he hadn't enjoyed, was Garrett Lyle. Sara stopped. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Pruitt's in surgery," he said. "I know. You caught it." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Baird called me when they opened. The hematoma was significant. Another hour." He stopped. "Another hour and the outcome would have been very different. I know that too." Lyle looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. "The inquiry. Cook told me some of it." He paused. "I want to be on record as a supporting witness for your account of today." Sara studied him. "Why?" she said. He looked slightly like a man who had been asked to explain something he'd already argued with himself about for an hour and was tired of the argument. "Because you were right this morning, and I didn't listen, and I—" He stopped, tried again. "Because what you did today mattered, and I was in this building for all of it, and I can say so." She looked at him for a long moment. "Talk to Cook," she said. "Tonight." She walked past him down the corridor. Behind her, she heard him knock on the consultation room door. She kept walking. At the end of the corridor, near the exit to the residence wing, her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number, different from Marcus Dean's, different from anyone she'd spoken to today. A Montana area code she didn't recognize. The message was 4 words. "I need to talk." And below it, a name she knew. A name she had not expected to see on her phone screen, in a hospital corridor in Creighton Falls, Montana, at 11:40 at night. A name that meant the Board of Review in 72 hours was not going to be the only thing arriving. The name on the screen was Aaron Rice. Sara stood in the corridor for a long moment without moving. The fluorescent lights ran their steady hum above her. Somewhere deeper in the building, a door opened and closed. Her thumb was on the screen, and she was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she usually wasn't. She called the number back. He picked up on the second ring. "Sara." His voice was exactly as she remembered it. A particular register, neither warm nor cold, the voice of someone who had learned early that neutrality was its own kind of power. "I wasn't sure you'd call back." "What do you want?" A pause. Not hesitation. Calculation. "I want to talk before the board, before this gets further out of either of our hands." "It's already out of your hands," she said. "You filed a formal statement." "So did you, apparently, 3 hours after mine." Another pause. "That was faster than I expected." "What did you expect?" "I expected you to wait, to see how things moved before you committed." He paused again. "You've been waiting for 14 months. I'm done waiting." Silence on the line for a moment, then, "The statement I filed, there are elements of it I may have characterized imprecisely." Sara closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, the corridor was exactly as it had been. "You characterized a patient death as my responsibility. That's not imprecise. That's a lie." The casualty review. Private Hendricks died of a penetrating wound to the chest that was non-survivable within the operational context, regardless of any intervention. That is documented in the field medical record. His death had nothing to do with the call I made. She kept her voice level. "You know that. You were there." The silence this time was longer. "What I know," Rice said slowly, "is that you went outside your authority, and the outcome was that 2 soldiers with survivable injuries survived, because I made a call that you refused to make." She moved closer to the wall, dropped her voice. "I've carried Keller for 14 months, Captain. I've let it cost me things I shouldn't have let it cost me. I'm not carrying your version of it. The board is going to want to hear both accounts." "Good, I'll be there." Another pause. When his voice came back, something in it had shifted. The neutrality was still there, but underneath it now was something that might have been unease, or might have been the specific discomfort of someone who had built an account on ground their realizing is less solid than they thought. "Dean's testimony supports my statement," he said. "Dean called me 2 hours ago," Sara said. "Whatever he signed 4 days ago, he called me to warn me tonight. That's not a man who's comfortable with what he put his name on." The silence on the line stretched. "The board convenes in 72 hours, Sara said. "If you have something you actually want to say to me, say it now. Otherwise, I'll see you there." She ended the call. She stood in the corridor another moment, phone in her hand, thinking about Aaron Rice's voice and what she'd heard underneath the neutrality. Not fear exactly, something adjacent. The sound of someone who had filed paperwork expecting it to stay paperwork and was now watching it become something larger. She went to bed. This was not simple. Sleep required a kind of release that her nervous system was not immediately prepared to offer. But she had learned in harsher conditions than this that the discipline of rest was not optional and that the body's accounting was accurate if delayed. She lay in the narrow bed of the on-call quarters, and she breathed and eventually she slept. At 6:15 her phone woke her. Cook. Rice withdrew the Hendricks casualty claim, he said without preamble, 40 minutes ago. Filed an amendment to his formal statement removing the allegation that you were responsible for a patient death. Sara sat up. What did he replace it with? He's still maintaining the unauthorized intervention characterization, but the mortality claim is gone. Cook paused. Whatever you said to him last night, I told him what I knew, she said, and apparently some part of what he built didn't hold up to him saying it out loud. The board process continues. The unauthorized intervention is still a finding he's pursuing. I know. But without the mortality claim, the board's authority to sanction your license is significantly narrowed. Another pause. Whitfield says it changes the landscape considerably. Sara stood, found her shoes. What about Dean? That's the other thing. Cook's voice shifted slightly. Dean called JAG at 0400 this morning. He's requesting to amend his testimony. She stopped with one shoe in her hand. He's retracting the corroboration, Cook said. He told the JAG coordinator that his original statement was, his word was pressured. He's asking to give a revised account before the board. Sara sat back down on the edge of the bed. She thought about Marcus Dean's voice on the phone, flat with urgency, and the date on his statement, 4 days before he'd called her. She thought about what it meant to sign something you knew wasn't entirely true, and then call the person it was going to hurt. He'd been trying to tell her something. She just hadn't had all the pieces yet. Okay, she said. There's more. Cook's voice carried the particular flatness of someone delivering information they know will land hard. Rice's legal representative contacted Iron Ridge administration overnight. They're arguing that your emergency response yesterday afternoon, the mass casualty event, constitutes evidence of unauthorized scope of practice, and they're requesting that your contract placement be suspended pending the board. Sara put her shoe on. Fenwick's response? She said. Fenwick told them she would take it under advisement. A pause, which I interpreted as a polite way of telling them to get out of her administrative jurisdiction. And Lyle? Lyle submitted a formal witness statement at 11:50 last night supporting your conduct during yesterday's emergency. I didn't ask him to. He came to me. Cook paused again. That was not what I expected from him. He was in the building all day, Sara said. He saw what happened. People see things and stay quiet about them all the time. I know, she said. He didn't. She finished tying her shoes and stood up. What time do I need to be where? 7:30, Fenwick's office. There's going to be a full administrative meeting. Fenwick, myself, department heads, and a representative from the Federal Nursing Oversight Board who drove up from Billings last night. Last night? The Keller board process and the mass casualty response have created a situation where this facility is receiving more federal attention than it typically does in a year. A pause. Fenwick is handling it well, but the meeting this morning is going to determine several things at once. I'll be there, she said. She had 45 minutes. She showered, changed, found coffee that was marginally better than the previous day's supply, and stood at the window of the small staff lounge watching Creighton Falls come into its morning light. The mountains were visible today, clear and close in the way they got when the temperature dropped overnight and the air thinned. She thought about what she was going to say in 45 minutes and how she was going to say it, and she thought about whether she was ready, and she decided that ready was not the operative condition. Prepared was different from ready. She was prepared. Fenwick's office was larger than Sara had expected, a corner room on the second floor with 2 windows and a conference table that held 8 chairs, all of which were occupied when Sara arrived at 7:28. She recognized most of the faces: Cook, Hatch, Carver from trauma, Davies from pre-op, Ellsworth from the overnight ED, Fenwick at the head of the table, and at the far end, a woman in her 60s wearing civilian clothes but with the posture of someone who had worn a uniform long enough that it had become permanent. This would be the Oversight Board representative, whose name tag said Dr. Lenora Pike. And next to Pike, in the chair he had taken with the careful positioning of someone who understood spatial politics, Garrett Lyle. Sara took the remaining chair. Fenwick opened the meeting with the administrative precision that Sara had come to understand was her primary professional mode: clear, sequential, without redundancy. She laid out the agenda: the mass casualty response review, the pre-op incident, the federal board process, and the question of Sara's contract status. Pike spoke for the first time when Fenwick finished the overview. Her voice was dry and flat and entirely without performance. I reviewed the documentation from yesterday's events on the drive up. Both events. She looked at Sara. I have questions. All right, Sara said. Your contract placement form lists your certifications accurately, but your employment history shows a gap of 14 months described as independent consulting. That's accurate. What were you consulting on? My own re-entry into civilian nursing. Sara kept her voice level. I left active military service under circumstances that required some time to process. I wasn't ready to work in a high-intensity environment immediately. I took lower acuity placements while I determined whether I could perform at the level my certifications indicated. Pike looked at her for a long moment. And could you? I believe yesterday answers. Something that might have been the infrastructure of a smile moved through Pike's expression and didn't quite surface. The Keller board process. Yes. You've given a formal statement to JAG. I've read it. Pike set her hands flat on the table. The original board exonerated you. Completely. The current process was initiated by Captain Rice, and as of 4 a.m. this morning has been significantly altered by Rice's own amendment. She paused. I want you to tell me, in your own words, in this room, what happened at Keller. Sara looked around the table. Hatch, who had not heard any of this. Carver, same. Davies, who was watching her with the expression he'd had when he set the EKG readout on her desk. Something working through him that hadn't finished yet. Lyle, who was looking at the table. She told them. She told it the same way she'd told it to JAG. Precise, clinical, without editorial. But in this room, without the remove of a phone line, it landed differently. She described the night at Keller Forward Operating Base, the call that had been made, the call she had made instead, the two soldiers who had survived because of the second call, Private Hendricks, who had not survived, and the specific medical reality of why that had nothing to do with her intervention. The board's exoneration, Aaron Rice's subsequent account, which had emerged 14 months later, and across which she had now put her actual name. The room was quiet when she finished. Pike said, You made an unauthorized call that saved 2 lives and you've spent 14 months in reduced acuity placements because you weren't certain you'd be believed. Sara considered the framing. I spent 14 months not wanting to be a case. I wanted to be a nurse. And yesterday? Yesterday I was a nurse. I just happened to also become a case. Pike made a note, then looked at Fenwick. What's the contract status? Fenwick said, Rice's representative requested suspension. I declined to act on that request pending this meeting. The grounds for the request? Unauthorized scope of practice during the mass casualty response. Pike looked at Hatch. Charge nurse. You authorized her response? Immediately, Hatch said. I needed hands. She was the best hands in the room. Within her certification scope? Every intervention she performed was within her trauma nursing certification. Hatch paused. Some of it pushed the practical edge of what someone in a contract placement would typically be asked to do. But nothing she did was outside her license. Pike made another note. Then she looked down the table at Lyle. Dr. Lyle, she said, you're on record as a supporting witness for Nurse Voss's conduct. Tell me about the pre-op incident from your perspective. Lyle was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man who had made a decision and was now being required to inhabit it in front of people, which was a different experience from making the decision alone. I dismissed her observation, he said. She reported an irregular cardiac finding on a pre-surgical patient. I dismissed it based on the existing chart and my assessment that a Ward B contract nurse wasn't a credible source for a clinical override on my pre-op team's evaluation. He paused. The EKG she requested confirmed the finding. The patient's surgery was postponed. Cardiology has since confirmed a ventricular arrhythmia that would have presented extreme risk under general anesthesia. He said all of this in the flat, measured tone of a man giving a medical report, without the self-flagellating performance that would have made it feel like theater, and without the minimizing hedges that would have made it feel like excuse. Just the facts, in sequence, with their implications clear. And you're comfortable stating that her intervention was clinically appropriate? Pike asked. More than appropriate. He looked up from the table for the first time. It was correct. And I didn't listen, and that... He stopped. The EKG is in the record. The cardiologist's report is in the record. I don't need to editorialize. Pike looked at him for a moment. No, she said. You don't. She wrote something in her notes, capped her pen, and looked at Fenwick. I'd like to see the overnight incident documentation before I make a formal recommendation. The Pruitt case. I'll have it to you within the hour, Fenwick said. The meeting broke into smaller conversations. Sara was speaking with Cook about the board timeline when Davies appeared at her elbow, quietly, the way he'd appeared at the Ward B entrance with the EKG printout. Holt's been moved to the cardiology ward, he said. I wanted me to tell you... Davies stopped. Tried again. He said to tell you he doesn't know your name, but he knows what you did. Sara looked at him. I told him your name, Davies said. Okay, she said. Davies nodded once, the same nod he'd given her across the ED yesterday, and walked away. The Oversight Board's formal recommendation arrived at 11 a.m. Pike presented it in Fenwick's office with only Fenwick, Cook, and Sara present. It was 3 pages, clear-languaged, and it said several things. It said that Sara's intervention in pre-op had been outside standard protocol for her placement tier, but was clinically defensible and had produced an unambiguous patient benefit. It said that her mass casualty response had been within her certification scope, had been authorized by the charge nurse on duty, and had contributed to positive patient outcomes in at least 3 documented cases. It said that the Keller board process, in light of Rice's amended statement and Dean's withdrawal of corroboration, should be reviewed by the full military medical board with Sara's JAG statement entered as primary testimony. And it said, in language that was bureaucratic on the surface, but beneath which was something fairly unambiguous, that the placement of a trauma nurse with Sara's credential profile in a General Ward B assignment at a veterans medical facility was a significant misuse of institutional resources. Sara read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at Fenwick. The contract placement, Sara said. What happens to it? Fenwick looked at her with the expression of someone about to say something that had a complicated interior. The oversight recommendation suggests a significant reclassification. She paused. We've been short-staffed in trauma for 8 months. We lost our senior trauma nurse to retirement, and the position has been open since April. Another pause. I'd like to discuss whether you'd consider a permanent placement, not contract, staff. Sara looked at the wall for a moment. That's a different conversation, she said. It doesn't have to happen today, Fenwick said, or this week. No, Sara agreed. It doesn't. The afternoon moved through its paces in the particular way that days moved after something large. A sense of the ordinary machinery re-engaging, people returning to their normal functions, the emergency having receded to a thing that had happened rather than a thing that was happening. Sara worked her Ward B shift with the steadiness she'd brought to the first 4 hours of the previous day, before everything had accelerated. She checked Mr. Adler, who was doing better and whose medication adjustment had been made, and who told her his granddaughter's team had won their game on Saturday. She was in the documentation room at 3 p.m. when Cook came in. Rice called JAG again this morning, he said. She looked up. He's dropped the unauthorized scope of practice complaint entirely. Cook sat down across from her. He's maintaining the Keller unauthorized intervention characterization, but he's filed it now as a professional conduct notation rather than a cause for license review. He paused, which is a significantly different category. He's trying to land somewhere that costs me less while still costing me something, Sara said. Yes. Because his attorney told him the original position wasn't going to hold. Most likely. Cook looked at her. The board still convenes, but Whitfield says the landscape now is review of the incident, probable confirmation of the original exoneration, a conduct notation that goes in your file but doesn't restrict your license. Sara thought about this. And Dean's revised testimony? He's giving it tomorrow. Whitfield has spoken with him. Cook paused. He told Whitfield that Rice came to him 6 weeks ago, that he made representations to Marcus about how the board process would proceed and what Dean's cooperation would ensure. Another pause. Apparently what Rice told him and what actually happened diverged enough that Marcus started reconsidering. Sara thought about Marcus Dean at 28, 11 months in a forward environment, the particular kind of loyalty that developed in those conditions, and the particular kind of vulnerability it created. Rice leveraged the relationship, she said. That's Dean's account. She picked up her pen and set it down again. Is Marcus going to be okay? Cook looked at her, the look of someone recalibrating their understanding of a conversation. Probably. Cooperating with the revision of testimony tends to be viewed more favorably than the original statement. That's not what I asked. A pause. I don't know, Cook said. He made a choice that wasn't right, and he's correcting it. What that does to him internally isn't something I can predict. No, Sara agreed. It's not. The afternoon went on. At 4:15, Carver appeared in the Ward B doorway and told her that Sergeant Pruitt had come out of surgery stable, hematoma fully evacuated, neurofunction intact, prognosis good. She thanked him and went back to her documentation and allowed herself 30 seconds to feel the specific relief that patient outcomes produced before she moved on. At 5 o'clock, Garrett Lyle appeared. This was becoming a pattern, she noticed. Lyle finding her at the end of the day, in the quieter corridors, after the building had shifted into its less populated rhythms. She wasn't sure whether he was aware of the pattern. Pike's recommendation, he said. Have you read it? Yes. He stood in the doorway in a way that was less commanding than his usual posture. Not diminished exactly, but without the particular inflation that he'd carried through most of the previous day. The section on placement resources. I read it. Fenwick spoke to me about the trauma position. He paused. I want to be direct with you. Okay? I didn't handle yesterday morning correctly. He stopped. I've been told this before. About my approach to input from staff I haven't worked with. I've been told it's a problem, and Another stop. I've not addressed it adequately. Sara looked at him and waited. If you take the position, he said, I want to tell you directly that yesterday changed how I understand your capability, and that I won't. He looked at the wall briefly. I won't dismiss input because of where someone sits on an org chart. Sara considered several responses. That's a decision you have to make regardless of whether I take the position, she said. Because there are other nurses in this building who've been telling you things you haven't been hearing. He looked at her. Hatch has been telling you things, she said. Davies. The pre-op team sees what they see, and they bring it to you, and you make them feel like they've wasted your time. She paused. That's a pattern that costs patients. Not just yesterday. Over time, something crossed his face that was uncomfortable and present, and not immediately defended against. I know, he said. Then fix it, she said. Not because I'm watching, because it matters. He stood in the doorway another moment. Then he nodded, a short, real nod, without ceremony, and left. Sara sat in the documentation room and thought about the conversation and how it had gone and whether it would hold. She didn't know. People committed to changes in the aftermath of crisis, and sometimes those commitments survived the return of ordinary conditions, and sometimes they didn't. She was not in the business of managing other people's follow-through. What she was in the business of was doing her job. She finished her documentation, collected her tablet, and walked the ward one final time before handoff, checking monitors, checking faces. The particular attentiveness that she'd developed over 13 years of learning what people looked like when something wasn't right. Mr. Adler was sleeping. The other patients were stable. The night nursing lead, a quiet woman named Sefton, who had clearly heard things about the previous 24 hours and was being carefully normal about it, took the handoff without drama. Sara went to the break room. She made coffee. She sat at the table where yesterday Cook had sat down across from her, and the day had changed direction. She was tired in a way that was earned and not especially alarming, and the coffee was bad and she drank it anyway. Her phone was on the table and it buzzed. She looked at it expecting Cook, or Whitfield, or some new development from the board machinery. The name on the screen was Marcus Dean. She answered. I know you have no reason to talk to me right now, he said. I'm talking to you. I signed something I shouldn't have signed. He paused. I told myself the story a certain way and Another pause. Longer. He told me you'd already agreed to a conduct notation, that you'd signed something acknowledging the Keller call was outside your authority, and that the board process was just formality, that my corroboration wouldn't change anything except make it formal, Sara said. Yeah. And you believed him. I wanted to believe him, Marcus said. That's different. I knew it wasn't. Part of me knew. His voice was rough in the way of someone who hasn't been sleeping well. You know how it is? You know what that kind of relationship does to your judgment. She did know. 14 months in a forward environment. The architecture of trust that got built in conditions like that, and what happened when someone who knew the architecture decided to use it. I know, she said. I'm fixing it, he said, for whatever that's worth. It's worth something, she said. Probably more than you think. A pause. Are you... He stopped. Are you going to be okay? With the board? Yes, she said. I think so. Another pause. Good. His voice settled slightly. Yeah, good. She ended the call and sat with her coffee and the bad fluorescent light of the break room and the sounds of Iron Ridge moving into its evening. The board was in 53 hours. She was as ready as she was going to be, which was not the same as fully ready, but was what she had, and in her experience it was usually enough. She picked up her coffee. Her phone buzzed again. Not a call. An email. From a federal address she didn't recognize, with a subject line that took her 3 readings to fully process. RE, Keller Incident, Supplementary Evidence Submission, Captain A. Rice, Internal Communication Records. She opened it. She read the first paragraph, then she stood up from the table. The supplementary evidence was not from Rice. It was from JAG's own investigation, initiated after Rice's amended statement had triggered a closer look at the timeline of his original complaint. What JAG had found, in communication records that Rice had apparently not considered discoverable, was a series of messages between Rice and a member of the original Keller Board review panel, messages that predated Rice's formal statement by 4 months, in which the shape of the complaint against Sara had been discussed, revised, and strategically constructed. It was not a personal grievance. It had been a coordinated effort. And the board member whose name appeared in those communications, the signature on 2 of the most critical messages, the person who had apparently advised Rice on how to frame the casualty allegation for maximum impact, was a name Sara recognized, a name she had seen on the original Keller exoneration document, a name that meant the exoneration itself might have been designed not to clear her fully, but to establish a record that could be selectively revisited. She stood in the break room holding her phone. The coffee was getting cold. Outside the door, the hospital moved through its evening shift change, ordinary and steady, entirely unaware that the thing Aaron Rice had built, the careful, coordinated architecture of a case that had been designed to find her, eventually, wherever she had gone, was now fully visible in the light. All of it. And the name at the bottom of those messages was the name of the person who had signed her original exoneration, which meant the exoneration and the threat had come from the same hand. She forwarded the email to Cook at 5:47 p.m. with no message attached, just the forward. He would know what it meant. Then she sat back down and finished the cold coffee, because there was nothing else immediately available to do, and because her hands needed something to hold. The name in those messages was Brigadier General Thomas Harwick. She had met him once, briefly, at the formal proceeding that had produced her exoneration. He had been one of 5 panel members. He had not spoken much during the session she'd attended. He had signed the exoneration document with a blue pen and looked at her with the particular expression of someone completing a task. She understood now what the task had actually been. The exoneration had been real. She had been exonerated, genuinely, because the facts supported it, and the other 4 panel members had read the facts cleanly. But Harwick had signed it knowing that his subsequent work with Rice would allow it to be reopened. The exoneration was not protection, it was positioning, a document that could be revisited selectively, used to imply that what had been cleared once might bear further scrutiny under different framing. It was sophisticated. She had to give it that. It required patience and coordination and the willingness to work across a 14-month timeline. Whatever Aaron Rice had done, he hadn't done it alone, and he hadn't done it simply. Her phone rang. Cook. I've read it, he said. And? And I've already forwarded it to the JAG coordinator and to the Oversight Board representative. Pike is still in Creighton Falls. She was planning to stay through the board process. A pause. Sara, this changes things significantly. I know what it changes. Harwick's involvement means the original board composition is compromised. The entire Keller review process is going to be reassessed by an independent panel. His voice was steady, but underneath it was something that might have been controlled anger, the specific kind that belonged to people who had spent careers operating within institutional structures, and had just discovered one of those structures had been deliberately corrupted. Rice's complaint doesn't go to the scheduled board. It goes to an independent inquiry. Everything goes under review. Including Rice, she said. Including Rice. A pause. And Harwick. She stood up from the table and walked to the window. The parking lot, the mountains, the last of the daylight going pink along the ridgeline. How long? She said. The independent inquiry process, weeks, not days. But the immediate board convening is suspended. Your license status remains current and unrestricted as of tonight. Another pause. Whitfield says to tell you the conduct notation Rice was pursuing is also suspended pending the inquiry outcome. Sara stood at the window and breathed. Unrestricted, current. The specific weight of those words settled through her in a way that was not triumphant exactly. More like the feeling after you've been holding a position for a very long time and someone finally tells you you can stand down. Okay, she said. There's one more thing, Cook said. Whitfield is going to want Harwick's communication records examined for any other cases. It's possible this wasn't the first time he participated in shaping a review outcome. I know, she said. You're the one who found it. The JAG inquiry triggered it, but you gave them the statement that gave them the timeline, that gave them the grounds to pull the communication records. Marcus found it too, she said. He told them about the 4-month predating of Rice's approach. That's what flagged the timeline. A pause. You're not wrong. She wasn't. Marcus Dean had made a bad choice and then corrected it, and that correction had been the thread that unraveled everything. People were not simple. The worst thing they did was rarely all they were. Get some rest, Cook said. Tomorrow is going to be a different kind of complicated. She ended the call and stood at the window until the pink left the mountains entirely, and they went back to their dark blue evening shapes. And then she went to find something to eat that was better than vending machine options, which in Creighton Falls at 6 p.m. required some effort, but was not impossible. The next 48 hours moved with the particular rhythm of institutional machinery in motion, not fast, but inexorable, with its own momentum. Pike convened an emergency session with JAG the following morning. The communication records between Harwick and Rice were formally entered into the independent inquiry record. Harwick, reached by JAG at his home in Virginia, initially declined to comment. His legal representative issued a statement by afternoon that said nothing while using many words to say it. Rice's own attorney withdrew from the case by end of business the following day. Sara learned these things in pieces, through Cook and through Whitfield, and once through a brief, carefully worded email from JAG that she read 3 times and then put in a folder on her phone labeled simply Record. She did not obsess over them. She had found, in her years of doing difficult work in difficult places, that obsessing over the machinery of justice while it ran was like watching water boil. It did nothing to affect the process and cost you attention you needed for other things. She worked her shifts. She watched Mr. Adler's recovery progress to the point where his daughter arrived to take him home, which produced a conversation between father and daughter in the ward hallway that Sara was not party to, but could hear enough of to understand was a long time coming. She continued monitoring the Pruitt follow-up. He was awake, alert, asking when he could return to duty, which the neurology team was handling with the patient diplomacy of people who had given that answer many times before. She checked on Jamie Holt twice. He was in the cardiology ward now, working through the specialist consultations that would determine the path forward for his arrhythmia. On her second visit, he was sitting up in bed reading something on his phone, and he looked up when she came in. "You're the one Davies told me about," he said. "Probably." "He said you heard something that morning, and nobody listened." "Some people listened eventually." Holt looked at her with the direct appraisal of a young soldier who hadn't yet learned to make his assessments less visible. "They said I would have been in serious trouble under anesthesia. There would have been a significant risk, yes." "So you—" He paused. "I mean, you caught it." "I listened," she said. "That's usually most of it." He looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," he said, simply, without the performance of it. "Get better," she said. "Do whatever cardiology tells you." She left before he could say anything else, because she didn't need anything from that conversation except what had already been exchanged. On the third day, Garrett Lyle requested a department-wide meeting. Sara heard about it from Torres, who heard about it from someone in the surgical wing, and she filed it in the same mental category as other things she was aware of but not directly involved in. She had enough of her own situation to manage. The meeting happened on a Thursday morning in the hospital's main conference room, which was large enough to hold the nursing staff, the surgical team, the ED personnel, and the department heads. Sara was there because she was on shift and because Hatch had asked her to attend as part of the ED team. She stood near the back. Lyle stood at the front. He was in his white coat, which she had come to understand was his armor and his flag simultaneously, but he was wearing it differently today, or she was seeing it differently, which might have been the same thing. He spoke for 11 minutes without notes. He did not describe the previous week as a learning experience, which was the language people used when they wanted to acknowledge something without being specific about it. He was specific. He described the pre-op incident with clinical accuracy. His dismissal of a clinical observation from a nurse he had not bothered to evaluate on her merits, the EKG result, what would have happened without it? He described what he had observed during the mass casualty response. He described the pattern that Cook and Fenwick and Pike had documented in the administrative review, the consistent dismissal of nursing staff input in contexts where that input was clinically relevant. He said, "I've been running this department as if the hierarchy of credentials was the same thing as the hierarchy of clinical observation. It's not, and it's cost us." The room was quiet. "We're going to change how we handle clinical flags from nursing staff," he said. "That process is going to be written, formal, and binding, not a courtesy protocol, a requirement." He paused. "I'm asking department heads to submit proposals by next Friday, and I want nursing staff represented in the drafting." He looked at Hatch when he said that last part. Hatch looked back at him with the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time to hear something in that general vicinity and was reserving judgment on whether it would last. Sara watched from the back of the room. She understood that this moment was imperfect. Lyle had not transformed. He was still the man who had sent her for coffee, who had dismissed her in front of his staff, who had prioritized his own authority over a 24-year-old soldier's cardiac safety. An 11-minute speech did not undo those things. A policy proposal did not undo them. What it did was potentially prevent them from being repeated on someone who didn't have Sara's record, someone who would stay quiet because they had less to stand on, someone who would let the dismissal happen and carry it home and come back the next day and be a little more diminished. That mattered. Even imperfectly, even incompletely, it mattered. She did not applaud when he finished. Neither did most of the room. It wasn't that kind of moment. But she noted the stillness as people processed it, and she noted that Davies, from his position near the surgical team, was looking at the floor with an expression that suggested something had settled in him that had been unsettled for a while. The independent inquiry's preliminary findings arrived on a Tuesday, 15 days after Sara had forwarded that email from the break room window. Whitfield called her personally. The findings were, the original Keller exoneration was confirmed and would stand. The conduct of Brigadier General Thomas Harwick in his post-proceeding communications with Rice was referred to a military ethics board for formal review. Captain Aaron Rice's complaint against Sara was dismissed in its entirety. A notation was entered in Rice's own record regarding the nature and construction of the complaint. The independent inquiry would continue examining Harwick's other case involvements. Sara was not required to participate further unless subpoenaed as a witness, which Whitfield considered unlikely. "Your record," Whitfield said, "is clean. Cleaner than it was before this started, actually, because the exoneration now has the independent confirmation attached to it." Sara was sitting in the Ward B documentation room when she took this call. The monitor at the nursing station behind her ran its steady rhythm. Somewhere in the ward, Sefton was doing a vitals check, humming something under her breath that Sara couldn't identify. "Thank you," Sara said to Whitfield. "You did the hard part," Whitfield said. "I just filed the paperwork." After the call, Sara sat for a while and looked at the wall. She thought about the specific cost of 14 months. The contract placements, the reduced ceilings, the deliberate smallness she had arranged for herself in order to avoid becoming a case while the machinery of other people's interests ground through its process. She thought about the skills she'd kept sharp in spite of the constraints. Because she couldn't help it, because the knowledge was wired into her, and refusing to use it would have been refusing to be herself. She thought about walking through Iron Ridge's automatic doors at 5:41 in the morning with a broken zipper on her duffel bag, and no rank on her chest, and no expectation that anything would be different than it had been everywhere else. The difference had come from a 24-year-old soldier mentioning that his heart sometimes skipped when he woke up. Most of the meaningful things she had found came from paying attention to the small details that other people had decided not to have time for. Cook appeared in the doorway. She hadn't heard him coming, which meant she was more tired than she'd realized, or that he moved more quietly than she'd given him credit for. "Whitfield called you," he said. "Yes." He came in, sat across from her. "No folder this time, no documents. Fenwick wants an answer about the permanent position," he said. Sara looked at him. "Not today," he said, "but she's going to need to start the formal hiring process if you're interested, and she'd like to know before she lists it externally." Sara thought about the answer to this question. She had been thinking about it for 15 days, in the spaces between shifts and calls and documentation, in the particular quiet of the overnight hours when the building settled into itself, and she could hear the monitors running their steady work. She had not made herself small because she was afraid of the work. She had made herself small because the structures around the work had been unsafe, and she had needed time to understand whether that was a condition of the work itself or a condition of the particular machinery she'd been caught in. Sitting in the Ward B documentation room, she thought the machinery had been the problem, not the work. "Tell Fenwick yes," she said. Cook nodded once. He didn't make anything of it, didn't congratulate her, didn't add commentary. She appreciated that. "There's a training coordination role attached to the trauma position," he said. Fenwick mentioned it. Military emergency response training for incoming staff. "She mentioned it to me too. Would you consider it?" She thought about Ortega holding a position in Base 7 without freezing. She thought about what it had taken to get there. Not just his willingness, but the specific guidance, the hand placement, the voice that said exactly here, "Don't move." She thought about all the people who came through emergencies that they were technically trained for but practically underprepared for, and what the gap between those two things cost in real terms. "Yes," she said. Cook stood up. He did something then that she hadn't seen him do in 2 days of high-stakes institutional navigation. He extended his hand. She stood and shook it. "For what it's worth," he said, "you handled all of this with more steadiness than most people manage in half the circumstances." "I had a lot of practice being steadier than I felt," she said. He almost smiled. "This time it got a little further than before." "That's usually how it works," he said, and left. On her last day as a contract nurse, Sara did something she hadn't done in 14 months. She wore her certifications on her badge. All of them. The full stack. The trauma certifications, the military nursing credentials, the field emergency designations. She had kept them current because she couldn't bring herself not to, but she had been presenting the minimum required for the contract level, nothing more. She clipped the full badge to her collar on a Thursday morning and walked through Iron Ridge's automatic doors the same way she had on her first day. But the building felt different at her back this time, or she was different in it, which might have been the same thing. Hatch saw the badge at the nursing station handoff and looked at it for a moment without comment, then looked at Sara's face, then back at the badge. "Huh," Hatch said. "Huh," Sara agreed. Hatch handed over the shift report and they got to work. The day was an ordinary day, which was its own kind of extraordinary after the previous 3 weeks. No mass casualty events, no pre-op discoveries, no late-night JAG calls. Just the work, the monitoring, the charting, the attention to the specific details that the work required. Mr. Adler was gone. Sergeant Pruitt would be transferred to a rehabilitation facility the following week. Jamie Holt had been discharged to cardiology outpatient follow-up with a treatment plan and strict instructions and the phone number of a specialist in Billings. She worked through to the end of the shift. At 4 o'clock, she was doing her final documentation when Torres appeared in the doorway. "There's something in the main conference room," Torres said. "Fenwick asked if you'd come." Sara looked at her. Torres had the expression of someone maintaining a carefully constructed neutrality. Sara saved her documentation and went. The conference room held more people than she'd expected, not the whole hospital, but a significant portion of the people she'd worked alongside in the previous 3 weeks. Hatch, Davies, Carver, Ellsworth, Ortega, who was off shift but present anyway, in civilian clothes and looking like he'd made an effort. Torres, the night nursing team, a handful of the surgical staff. Fenwick was at the front of the room. Lyle was there too, standing to one side, which was notable because he was not the kind of man who typically attended other people's moments. "We don't do this often," Fenwick said when Sara came through the door. "And we're not going to make it longer than it needs to be because the people in this room have work to do." Sara stood near the entrance and waited. "Effective Monday," Fenwick said. "Sara Voss will join Iron Ridge Veterans Medical Center as lead trauma nurse and emergency response training coordinator." She paused. "That's the official part. The unofficial part is that everyone in this room was here last week when a woman carrying a broken duffel bag and a Ward B assignment walked into an emergency and didn't hesitate. And I think we all have something to say about that, even if most of us are going to say it quietly." She looked at Sara. "You deserve the quiet version and the loud version. You'll get whichever one feels right." The room applauded. Not the performative kind, the kind that comes from people who mean it and aren't entirely sure how to express that meaning, so they use their hands. Sara stood at the front of the room and felt the specific discomfort of being seen, which was not entirely unpleasant, but was not entirely comfortable either. Ortega caught her eye from across the room and gave her a nod that was trying to be professional and was mostly just young and genuine. She nodded back. After the room cleared, it cleared fast because Fenwick had been right that there was work to do. Lyle stopped beside her near the doorway. He looked at her badge, the full credential stack. "You should have worn that from the first day," he said. "Probably," she said, "but I needed to know whether the work was possible without it." He looked at her for a moment. "Was it?" She thought about Davies' EKG printout on the desk, about Hatch's 2-second assessment in the ED, about Ortega's hands holding position in Bay 7. "Mostly," she said. "The work usually is. It's the structures around it that make it harder than it needs to be." He held the doorway for her. It was a small thing, and she didn't miss it. She found the break room empty at 6 that evening, and she sat at the same table and she was quiet for a while. The monitors ran their rhythm through the walls. The building breathed around her, doing the thing it did, the thing it had been built to do, holding people through their worst moments and returning them, changed, to their lives. She had been inside that function for 13 years in various forms, and she had never stopped believing that it mattered. That was the thing about her that Lyle hadn't understood on the first day, and Rice had never understood at all. The reason she stayed quiet in rooms that dismissed her was not because she accepted the dismissal. It was because she was conserving something for the moment when the dismissal would cost someone else. And that moment always came, and she was always ready for it. The quietness was not weakness. It was load-bearing. She had learned this the hard way, in forward operating bases and understaffed wards and contract placements where nobody was waiting for her. And she carried the knowledge with its full weight, not as wisdom, but as something more practical, a way of moving through systems that were imperfect without being destroyed by their imperfection, while still refusing to be made smaller than she was. She was 32 years old, and she was tired in the bone-deep way of someone who had been managing too much alone for too long. And she was also, she found, sitting in the break room with its bad fluorescent light, something adjacent to okay. Not fixed, not resolved in any clean sense. 14 months of arranged smallness didn't disappear because an inquiry cleared a record. Marcus Dean had signed something he shouldn't have signed and called her to warn her, and she didn't know yet what their friendship was on the other side of that. Aaron Rice existed in the world and would continue to. The machinery of Harwick's influence would take time to fully unravel. None of it was clean. But Sergeant Pruitt was in a rehabilitation facility beginning the work of recovery. Jamie Holt had a treatment plan and a cardiologist's phone number. The soldier in Bay 7 was alive. The soldier in Bay 3 had reached surgery in time. And on Monday, Sara Voss would walk back through Iron Ridge's automatic doors with her full name on her badge and a room that was hers to build into something useful, and she would begin the work of teaching other people how to see what she saw, how to hold a position under pressure, how to be the person in the room who doesn't freeze. She picked up her phone. There was a message from Cook sent an hour ago. 4 words. Harwick's facing formal review. She set the phone down. Outside the break room window, Creighton Falls was going dark, in the particular way of mountain towns in late October. Fast, clean, the light dropping all at once as the peaks cut the horizon. The mountains were not beautiful in any soft sense. They were large and indifferent, and they had been there before everything else, and they would be there after, and there was a kind of relief in that, actually, in being small against something that was simply large without agenda. She had come to this place to disappear. She had not disappeared. She had been seen, really seen, credential by credential, decision by decision, and she had survived the seeing, which was the thing she hadn't been certain of. The being seen was always the risk. The hiding was the response to the risk. And somewhere between a broken duffel bag and a broken zipper, and a soldier mentioning that his heart sometimes skipped, she had stopped hiding without quite making a decision to. That was how it went, she thought. You didn't usually decide to stop being afraid. You just found yourself in a moment where the thing in front of you mattered more than the fear, and you moved toward it, and then you did it again. And then at some point the distance between you and the fear was large enough that you could turn around and see it for what it was. Not a wall, not a verdict, just a feeling that had been given too much space. She stood up. She left the break room, walked the corridor, pushed through the exit door into the parking lot, where the cold hit her clean and immediate, and the mountains were dark shapes against a sky that hadn't finished going dark yet, still holding a thin edge of blue at the ridgeline. She breathed in the cold air. Iron Ridge Veterans Medical Center stood at her back, lit and working, doing what it did. Tomorrow, it would do it again. Monday, she would walk back in with a different kind of standing and a room to build and a ward to run, and it would be hard and imperfect and occasionally more than she could manage cleanly, and she would do it anyway. She had always done it anyway. That was the thing nobody in that building had understood when she arrived, and that most of them understood now. The woman who showed up carrying a broken duffel bag and got sent for coffee had never stopped working toward the same thing, in the same direction, with the same precision. The title had changed, the room had changed, the people looking at her had finally changed. She hadn't. She had just stopped letting them make her pretend she was less than she was. The edge of blue above the mountains held for another moment, then went. She turned around and walked back inside.